Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Are humans and wars becoming more humane, or are wars becoming endless? What mix of cultural and technological forces have been driving the evolution of warfare? In this episode, I explore these questions with intellectual historian and legal scholar Sam Moyn. Sam is the author of a book to be released in September called Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. It's an insightful treatment of the evolution of war and humanity's attempts to make it humane, but perhaps at the expense of making it perpetual. In this episode, I explore a range of issues with him about the history of war, the influence of technology in how it's conducted, and in particular, the role of the United States as the global cop in the post-Cold War era. Sam, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So today's topic is, I guess, an exploration of one of the darker sides of humanity, which is war. And you've just written this book called Humane, which is due to be out shortly. But, before we get into the book, I guess I'd just like to, ask you to say something about yourself that, maybe most people don't know, just sort of your journey to this point, whatever you want to talk about.
I'm pretty boring personally. I did grow up in the middle of the country in Missouri and lived there for what I used to say was the first half of my life. And since then, I've been coastal, teaching it at some of our best universities and really never leaving, except once. When I was in law school, I did serve in the White House as an intern during the American bombing of Serbia to protect Kosovars. And that figures in the book, actually, at a certain point, and is probably part of why I ended up writing it so many years later.
Yeah, I recall reading that part of your book, which for some reason also reminded me of this movie Black Hawk Down, which I think was set sometime in the 90s.
Right. Well, that's Somalia, which we kind of really cared about in the 1990s and is a kind of early moment in this really pivotal decade of the 1990s that transpired when I was young. And we can get into how that decade was so important even before 2001 kicked off the war on terror.
Yeah, I really look forward to getting into some of that substance. It's interesting. I come from a military family myself. Both my dad and my brother served in the army. So, wars have been very real to me. And, I think you have to be, I guess, part of a military family to know what it feels like, when your loved ones are sent into harm's way. And so I read your book with great interest. So let's start with your book, where you spend a considerable part in the beginning talking about War and Peace and Tolstoy and the progression in his thinking from the goal of war should be annihilation to, we need some rules.
Yeah, he's sort of the hero and sage of the book, and he gets the first chapter out of 8. And I started with him because, for one thing, I was a lit major, and I really thought it would be fun to start with the greatest portraitist of war, including its moral stakes. And I noticed that he was a really good witness of some really decisive kind of departures in the 19th century, which I think are with us still. At the dawn of the 19th century, when Tolstoy lived, warfare was modernized, and there were 3 big proposals about what that meant. One you could call intensification, and people like the Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz advocated for this, basically make war really harsh, and not just because he thought war was cool, but also because he thought it would leave us all better off if war were not kind of play acting. But then there were these 2 new groups. First were, let's call them not the intensifiers, but the humanizers. And their proposal is to civilize warfare and make it kinder and gentler. And Tolstoy has some characters in War and Peace who think about this proposal and denounce it. Actually, they denounce it because they're intensifiers, and they think we should really make war undisguised and leave its brutality kind of there, unregulated. Now, as Tolstoy got older, he helped invent the third view beside intensification and humanization. And let's call that one pacification. And I think changed the world because he had a Christian awakening and embraced the idea that what was wrong with not just intensification, but humanization was that they both leave war a kind of permanent fixture. And like some others in the 19th century, Tolstoy thought, we actually have something in our grasp, which is either ending war altogether or radically reducing its incidence. And so he pursued that agenda. And the reason I care so much about him is because of the arguments he made against humanization, which has become a prestige project in our time, our lifetimes, and transformed war, made it more humane. And I think Tolstoy was kind of the best early critic of what we've done to war in the last few decades.
So, talking about what we've done to war in the last few decades, I guess in addition to this thinking about war and its brutality and imposing some rules, at the same time, there's been technological development. How has tech impacted the intensification and humanization of war?
Well, very profoundly. I probably don't emphasize it enough in my own book, in part in my defense, because I think tech is our servant and it reflects us and our moral ambitions and choices. In the case of war, it seems like tech has a kind of Janus face. It could make war much worse and did, while it could also make war more humane. A great place to stop, actually, and I cover this in the book, is the invention of air power. Because there's one team of folks, not the leading commentators, but they're there, who think that air power will finally allow us to make war antiseptic. And you find even some of the earliest kind of theorists of aerial bombardment thinking that we will have precision enough to isolate military targets and avoid civilians. But the trouble is, first, it didn't work. The famous example of this would be Carl Norden's bomb sight in World War II, which was supposed to allow Americans to bomb with precision, but it didn't work. Now, there was a second reason, and it's that because there was another team at the birth of aerial bombardment, which thought this is going to be the best way to achieve our ends precisely by killing more civilians. And this was, not just an experiment. It was the first use of aerial bombardment in colonial air control, notably by the Brits. And so no wonder when they get to World War II, as the Americans are fiddling with their Norden bomb sight and not getting it to work, the Brits are just trying to bomb the Germans, the people, through so-called morale or strategic bombing, as the Americans also did, and more famously in Japan. So I think, we're in a moment now when we have a lot of new tech that allows us to, let's say, flirt with the dream of humane war in ways that the technology never allowed before. But the dream comes first and the tools come, later and evolve slowly.
There's nothing funny about this topic that we're discussing, but I don't know, are you a Seinfeld fan by any chance?
I did watch a few episodes in my youth.
But when I read your book, I was reminded of this episode where Elaine asks someone, would Tolstoy have had the same impact if his book had been published under its original title, which is War. What's it good for?
Right.
And the answer is absolutely nothing.
Right.
So,
That's very funny.
I was reminded of
That's
that.
very funny. I'll have to look back at that, which I don't remember, but it would have been appropriate for an epigraph or something like that.
Clearly the answer isn't absolutely nothing, because sometimes it's necessary. And I guess that's what I want to get into next, which is, what does humane war even mean? So let's just get a little bit deeper into that. And, what makes war absolutely necessary?
Good. Well, possibly nothing. Again, Tolstoy, as a Jesus freak, said don't ever have it, and encouraged conscientious objection, which affected a lot of Americans, including in Vietnam, who read him and decided not to serve. I'm not personally a pacifist, but the book's anti-war, just because in my lifetime it seems like we've had lots of unjustifiable wars that have failed to achieve their ends and made people worse off, including kind of beneficiaries of humanitarian intervention. And so I'm willing to kind of give Tolstoy a hearing. And his worries about the possibility, which he witnesses, very early, kind of glimmerings of humane war in the 19th century, is sort of kind of takes three forms. First, he says you can't make war humane. Like, the whole phrase is a contradiction in terms. It's an oxymoron. And I appreciate that a lot of folks will have that reaction to the phrase, but they would miss that war is not a static practice. We actually can change it. And that's where the law comes in. We've had a long campaign to develop two bodies of rules, which the book follows. One is a set of rules that Tolstoy did help inspire about not having war, stopping war before it starts or interrupting its continuation, as well as kind of containing its scope geographically. But there's this other body of war, which is humanizing war, making the fighting less brutal, making sure soldiers are taken care of, making sure civilians aren't targeted or the fewer have to die collaterally. And that's where Tolstoy's second and third arguments come into play. First, he said, we'll make bad compromises with militaries and states. And he analogized humane war to humane slavery, which was the main attempt to reform slavery before abolitionism arose. And afterwards, Tolstoy said it was a mistake because it entrenched chattel slavery. And he worried there's a risk in making war humane, that it will entrench war. Now, I don't think he was right in his lifetime, but it's happening now. And we can get into how that's happened. Then there was the third argument, which was about, let's say, the rest of us who are just kind of think we're good people out in the world. And we see that war is becoming more humane. Fewer die. Rules are followed, sometimes broken, but often followed. And we think we're okay now. We've made a kind of big move from the brutal war and the torture chambers and the mass civilian death to something new. And here Tolstoy uses a different analogy. He says, let's compare the slaughter of humans to the slaughter of non-human animals. And he says, there are lots of folks who aren't vegetarians who think that because they're calling for more humane slaughter of animals, that they're good people. And Tolstoy's claim is they're not, in part because more humanized slaughtering means for more death, and worse, critics kind of give up because they think they've done their job ethically by making sure that the killing is done humanely, even when it gets worse in numbers.
So there's a few things in your book that made me take note. And one of them, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that there have been more wars since 1989, or at least the U.S. has been involved in more wars since 1989 than, I don't know, like 100 years before that, or
since 1945. More American interventions occurred after 1989 than before, and that's really important because We may say that there are fewer international wars, and that may be true, but for American power as world policemen, this unilateral moment it enjoys after 1989 gave it a big choice. Like, do we consider the Cold War, when millions died for freedom, a kind of parenthesis that we close, an exception to the rule, and we now kind of stop kind of going to war? Or do we just the reverse, use the fact that no one opposes us, the Soviet Union gone, to engage in policing for good and ill, including when civilians are dying in places like Kosovo or later Libya in 2011. And America chose the latter path, and it began to engage in more intervention, actually, than it had done so in the Cold War.
So, but has this more intervention been accompanied by fewer casualties all around, both on the American side as well as on the opponents and civilians?
Absolutely. Well, so as a great power, America was often fighting asymmetrical wars all the way back against Native Americans on its own soil in the 19th century, against Philippine insurgents in its first kind of colonial experiment at the turn of the 20th century, and then in all those Cold Wars. Of course, it often had conventional wars, like in World War II, in one form of the Vietnam War. But after 1989, many of its wars became very lopsided. And, the Iraqi army was serious to beat twice, but even then it was pretty lopsided, as we know. And we see a kind of trend line that American force is more immune from bodily harm. So, you opened by saying you had family who had served in the army, but now there's much less cause, if you're an American, to worry that your family member, no longer husband, son, or brother, but it could be wife, daughter or sister, dies, because very few Americans die in American wars. But it's also, and I think even more important, that fewer on the other side die too, relative to prior eras, including the Cold War. So there's this interesting phenomenon that you get more intervention after the Cold War, but it's less grievous, more humane, but it also seems unstoppable.
So is it more humane because of technology? I mean, I see on the one hand that after the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the US was kind of the sole superpower, and it had been sort of the cop since the end of the Second World War, sort of global cop. And so I guess in one sense it was less fettered in its ability to intervene. But I guess technology had a lot to do with this as well, didn't it?
It did. As we say in ethics, ought implies can, and you can only fight a humane war if you actually can have the tools to do so, especially if your first item on the agenda is to immunize your own forces from harm. But again, you don't even have the idea of asking for that hardware as opposed to some other kind if you don't have some moral reason. And remember, there's technology all through the Cold War, but America generally seeks out technology like napalm and cluster bombs that will, far from proceeding humanely, proceed more grievously. So I want to insist that we not fetishize the technological availability. I think we have to look elsewhere, which is after the disaster in Vietnam, the anti-war movement fell, and some other folks became the more prominent reformers called human rights groups. And for the first time, these groups start monitoring wars for whether they're fought cleanly, not whether they're just or legal in their initiation, but whether the fighting is legal. And then you get the military, which is shamed by the public relations disaster of My Lai. And it gets ethics too. Now, there's genuine concern about honor there, but there's also optics. And the military takes the law seriously, really for the first time, and says that the troops have to follow it in the field, and they send lawyers to help pick targets from the air. So the first Gulf War after the end of the Cold War in 1991 is the first war that the group Human Rights Watch monitors for infractions of the laws of war. It's also the first war in which the military has lawyers helping pick targets. And so my sense is that the answer is really cultural before it's technological, but it did change the face of warfare thanks to new tools like drones that made the transition possible in our time.
So when exactly did law become a part of whether war is justified and how it is conducted?
Well, so as I mentioned, there are two bodies of law you could think of: a body of rules in the international system that says you can't go to war. And we generally say that the middle of the 20th century, taking advantage of Tolstoy's idea and lots of people who mobilized after him for peace, kind of brought new rules, mostly in the United Nations Charter of 1945. Now, that doesn't affect Americans because Americans can't really break the rules because they have a veto on the Security Council. Now, then there's this other body of law, which is about regulating the conduct of the fight once it's started. Again, can you torture? How do you treat detainees, like at Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo? How many civilians can you kill with drones? Those rules have a history I work really hard in the book to establish. There are some 19th century roots in the first Geneva Convention, which is about protecting soldiers who have been left to bleed out on the battlefield. And actually, Tolstoy is revising War and Peace at the time of this first treaty, and it's what makes him so angry. But what makes for a quantum leap in the laws of war, I think, happens in the 1970s. There had been these Geneva Conventions in 1949, which became very famous in the War on Terror, but they didn't do much, especially when it came to civilians. Rather, in the 1970s, after Vietnam precisely, states met. There were suddenly a lot of states because of decolonization, and they made new rules. They're called the Additional Protocols to the Geneva Conventions, and they said you can't shoot at civilians. That had not been a legal rule before. And they said you can only kill as many as your military advantage justifies. And you have to kind of calculate, is my advantage outweighing the civilian harm? Again, totally unprecedented. And Americans take these seriously. I mentioned the two main groups that do so: humanitarians outside government and the military inside government. And they start to fight with each other, not over whether American wars are good things, but whether they're humane enough yet. Of course, humanitarians want more humanity and military a little less. But that became defining in our time, that we had debates about the War on Terror, like, should there be torture in the mix? How many civilians should be allowed to die under the drones? How many is too much? But none of those questions are about whether America's at war. It's about what it does once it's at war.
Has terrorism like 9/11 changed the fundamental nature of war? Like when it's justified, especially the justification to act preemptively? In other words, has terrorism changed the battlefield radically?
Well, there's something to that, but let's recall that, as we were saying before, asymmetry is old. These great empires, like the British, were fighting asymmetrical wars around the world a century ago, and indeed in the same places that America has fought since 9/11. And counterinsurgent warfare, where great powers face ragtag bands, is also, centuries old. So the idea that something new happened after 1989 or 2001 seems dubious to me.
Is it really? But, because I mean, these ragtag bands, as long as they were doing their ragtag thing in Waziristan, I mean, that's one thing, right? But
Okay,
when they start doing their ragtag thing in the World Trade Center,
fair.
right, they're bringing it to you, right? So, so I guess that's what I'm getting at is that in that sense, war has changed because it's actually coming to you now on your turf when you least expect it, without any rules. I mean, because terrorism, by definition, I mean, you can't really have rules because then it's not terrorism. So hasn't the nature of conflict fundamentally changed?
I think there's something to that, but there's been that kind of terrorism in other forms pretty far back too. So the first attempt to respond to terrorism, like with international policing, occurred when a lot of kings and queens and princes and princesses were just shot dead or bombed in European capitals. Some American presidents were killed. And now, of course, they were not killed with an airplane flown into the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. So there's no doubt you're right that in part because of technology, terrorism could deal greater blows. But in the scheme of things, these were pinpricks that elicited massive response. And we've seen that over and over again in the past couple of 100 years. So I think we have to get really careful in asserting that there was something radically new. In the end, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, America ended up fighting in a very familiar way. And then against Al Qaeda or other offshoots of it, there were similar campaigns. The only difference would have to be, I think you're right, that those older ones, counterinsurgency across the world for centuries, really, it never was started by a threat that was global and had so visible a victory in the Atlantic space. Because there wasn't just 9/11, but there were also kind of attacks in later years in France and Spain of Islamist radicals. And so that kind of global scope of where terrorists could strike, there's some novelty to it, but I'd be very careful about getting too certain that we ever have been dealing with something radically new.
What grade would you give America? What marks would you give America in its role as this sort of world cop and, Pax Americana till recently? How do you think we've done?
This is a big part of the book. So the book argues that America made a big choice in between World War I and II to become a hegemon. And then you're right, we have to give it a grade. I think its success was to provide a transatlantic peace that was lacking. And if you like, it was a fulfillment of what Tolstoy and all the bands of peace activists who followed dreamed, because they often were looking not at these global empires, but at transatlantic war. And World War I and II were in part transatlantic, and America put a stop to those. It's edgy to say this, but this was a racialized phenomenon because America stepped in to achieve what was at first a peace that kept whites from killing other whites across the Atlantic. But there was a price, which is that America took on the role of global power that it had never been. Europeans had been doing it. And that meant that America, even if it gets a good grade in the transatlantic, gets, I think, a less good grade across the world. And, I'm for the idea that it gets some, let's say, like if its homework was late and we give a kid a pass, maybe the Cold War gives America, we don't grade it down so much, even though millions of Koreans, millions of Vietnamese, et cetera, died. But what about after 1989? So that's where we should look, because there's no more Cold War, and almost all American wars are disasters. Not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but even the humanitarian interventions it conducts, notably in Libya, which I mentioned in 2011, which made the country much worse and led to much more death than was expected, even under the grim scenarios that led to the humanitarian intervention. Then we get drone warfare and the rise of special forces. And that's what the book ends up being about. And I think this is, in a way, a scary development. We could debate what grade America gets for inventing this new humane form of war. It's not going south in the same way that America and Iraq and Libya went south and made more people die, maybe fewer die. But it also has led to something I think pretty new, which is humane surveillance and control as a permanent form of war, if you want to call it that. Or if you want to think about it in different terms, it's led America to be the first power that really engages in global policing. And I'm not sure we should have that kind of thing, even if we can't point to all the terrible consequences as we can for Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and other places since 1989.
So would your position be that America should refrain from being a global cop of the world?
I think so. I mean, it's not that there aren't bad people out there, but that it seems as if the attempt to be global policemen makes things worse. Very clearly in these big wars, but even in the case of kind of humane counterterror, it seems as if it's violent enough to lead to the perpetuation of terror. And maybe, like, above all is this, that when you have a single power doing what it wants, however humane, you're setting precedents for the future. And America is not going to be the sole hegemon forever, but it's writing the playbook for future powers, including Chinese power, and for a world in which will, given your interests in tech, we should note will involve not just drones, but so-called killer robots, autonomous weapon systems. And I'm very worried about what it looks like when the rule book that America has shredded, especially the rule book on going to war anywhere, however humanely, is picked up and dusted off by other powers in the future globally that we can imagine.
So, as problematic as policing is in terms of defining its rules and executing them, I'm trying to think of a credible alternative. It reminds me of this Churchill quote about democracy being a terrible form of governance, except that the others we've tried have been even worse. It seems like we're between a rock and a hard place here, aren't we?
I love that question because it's the question I really most hope to elicit from readers in this book. Because, I try to spotlight those actors like Barack Obama who defend humane war, defend the drones and special forces, and say, but you don't want the brutal war that I replaced with humane war, do you? And somebody has to do this. And as long as I'm in charge and it's not Donald Trump inheriting all these tools, you want it to be me. He said these things very openly, and it's very credible, leaving out the fact that, he didn't do anything to constrain Donald Trump from using the same tools and presumably in a less trustworthy way. So, I'm with you on the apparent superiority of policing to war, except that then we would demand that policing be policing and not war by another name. And I cover in the book some folks who really want policing to have the same rules that we would expect. Of course, American police don't even follow, as we know since last summer, but we at least say you have to, minimize violence. You have to ask for surrender before you shoot. You have to capture rather than kill your adversary. You can't use drones and robots unless we're really sure that they've been well programmed to follow the rules that humans must. But I think the deeper question is the one you've asked. like some terrible stuff goes down in the United States and no one proposes humanitarian intervention. There are no drones in our skies. I start out the book with a parable about two weddings, one near us and one far away. And I'm not sure we would accept a reality, however humane, in which some foreign power exerts control and surveillance over us who aren't the terrorists. And so I want to avoid, in spite of the importance of your question, a kind of glum defeatism that, well, America is the best that anyone's done. So let's just, accept that form of outcome rather than figure out, well, how can we get a global police force going if that's what we decide we need? And what are the better rules that it ought to follow? And would we accept those same rules if we were subject to policing? Now American politics is all about this now. On a global scale, we have policing, which is very asymmetrical. We're not policed, and there are parts of the world that are, just as there are parts of American cities that are policed, and there's under policing everywhere else, including for white collar crime and, the misdeeds of the powerful. So we do accept that asymmetry at home. We do accept it abroad, but should we? Can we just say, well, the past was worse? I hope not. That's the hope with which I conclude the book. But I get your question, because I think it's easy to say, well, it would be worse if Russia had a role in making the rules or in giving us its version of policing. And I agree with that. But I respectfully disagree with Churchill that if we've tried a lot of bad things, including bad forms of democracy that aren't really democratic, we should try other ones.
Fair enough, and well put. You spend also a considerable part of the book on Obama and the fact that he surprised a lot of people by his very extensive use of drones. And you mentioned one of the characters, I think it was Harold Coe, who you said, was sort of struggling with this question of, how do you really define rules in this new form of war? And I think the example you used is, let's say we've identified the top 3 levels of Al-Qaeda. So, what's a legitimate target? Is it only people who are known to be associated with these 3 levels? It's a tough thing to put rules around. And then actually, if I were to put on a Donald Trump hat, as scary as that sounds, right, he would have said, well, why would you telegraph these rules to the rest of the world? You want to keep people guessing. You don't want people to know your rules, because if they do, then they'll just start gaming you. So how do you design policy in a way that's flexible, isn't telegraphed, and yet not dependent on the person in charge, such as whether it's Trump or Obama? Seems like a tall order to define such a policy, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really smart question. So just for background for your listeners, I do spend the last chapter on Barack Obama's transformation of the war on terror, which really inspired this book. And I try to give him the fairest of possible hearings, because I think not only is he interesting and smart, but he was his own best critic. And I try to dramatize this by looking carefully at his moment of truth when he was yelled at by a peace activist in his main speech at Fort McNair explaining the drone war. And amazingly, he kind of tore up his speech and spoke improvisationally and engaged this heckler. And what he said was absolutely thrilling, that, maybe I'm mistaken, not just in turning to drones, but special forces and this broader, humane form of war, because it can have unintended consequences. It can spin out of control. It can affect our own national politics. And I actually believed all of those things happened. Trump, since we're talking about him, was following Obama's playbook in a certain way and running as an anti-war candidate, even if both governed as endless war presidents. So I take your, his struggles and your question really seriously. The question you asked is like the premise is that we're free and powerful enough to decide whether to follow the rules or not, which is a premise that only a very few people can adopt. And most of the victims of these wars aren't facing that set of questions. And it's like, should the mafia follow rules or not? Well, maybe the problem is the mafia. But again, I get it from the perspective of this kind of power at the top. These are real questions. And I guess my sense is that you will answer them the way Obama did. And I don't see American politicians really kind of reevaluating the war on terror. None has. They've all baked it in further. It's really kind of a global question for some Americans, but largely non-Americans, to think about, is this best for all of us? Is there a real threat? Is the response to the threat worthwhile? Do we want global policing, or do we want to accept a certain level of risk in the global community? All of these are questions I think we have to think more about, as global citizens, and not just people who can kill or not, follow rules or not, decide what safety means or not. Because, the safe and powerful amongst us, like you and me, we don't really have any skin in the game. We're not at risk. Certainly not of the choices we're making coming back to haunt us, unless you count the election of Donald Trump as a breakdown in the system we helped build, including in the war on terror.
So, talking about World Cup and other powers and other emerging powers, you didn't say much about China. In one of my previous episodes with Arun Sundarajan called The Technology Wars, we talked about how this new battleground between the US and China is to a large extent about the tussle for economic domination through digital platforms and 5G, areas that China has protected and nurtured. And drones are part of this technological battlefront that includes robotic surveillance and robotic battlefields, where it is investing heavily, perhaps even to export to other states. Should we be concerned about this model? What do you think about China?
I loved your earlier episode, and you've raised a question with a lot of different facets. So just let's begin with the literal war and where China may be going. So, because you're right that drones are just the leading edge of this larger turn towards a robotic battlefield. And I close the book talking about autonomous weapon systems. And, America and China are at one in refusing regulation of the so-called slaughter bots. And there will be arguments about what programming they should have, what rules they should have to follow, and whether we should, keep them from coming online, or whether we should demand certain humane robots or whatever. But, you're raising something bigger. Now, even to have this conversation, I think we have to think first about what China's global agenda is. It's just mistaken to say that China has been the main force for control and surveillance, because it's really done those things at a domestic level to its own citizens. Whereas it's the United States and some of its firms like Palantir that have globalized surveillance, including sold the techniques of surveilling citizens to some of the worst despots on earth. And those are Americans that have done that far more fervently than the Chinese. Furthermore, we're heading into a Cold War with China, but it's kind of funny. I don't think we have the info yet to really say what its global designs are. So just to take the topic of military basing, America has hundreds and China has one outside its territory in the Horn of Africa and Djibouti. It spends much less on its military. It has, fewer drones, and it doesn't seem as, let's say, interested in its own militarization of the world. So maybe it's early days, but maybe its agenda is just different, more economic and more about its own prosperity than ours has been, sadly, while we've, fiddled with military rule of the whole planet. Then we come to, I think, like the profound part of your question, which is that leaving aside kind of what we used to call war, there is going to be enmity among nations, including America and China, around cyber war and things that, we wouldn't have called war, but they involve things like shutting down factories, stealing technology. Now, again, those things are well underway, and America has participated with gusto in them, including in a lot of election interference and technology theft that now is making us very upset because other powers are doing them. And there's no doubt that China is very interested in exploring these uses of offensive force, because that's what it is in a good American tradition. I hope we can stop it. Again, I don't want to treat this future as foreordained. Then we get to maybe where I get most kind of excited and upset about your question, which is about the propriety of surveillance and control anywhere. Because as I've said, America has done the global job of spreading that, and China has perfected it relative to its own citizens. And it is amazing. When I went a couple of years ago, I was amazed just comparing communist China and communist Vietnam, how the one is completely creates a domestic space of watching, whereas the other is like there's almost no government visible or present. And I'm not sure we just ask people whether they like to be surveilled any more than we would ask people if they want to be slaves. There are actually a lot of slaves who liked it, but we didn't just take a vote.
I'm smiling. I mean, sorry to interrupt. I'm smiling because I'm reminded of this book called Surveillance Capitalism. Actually, America is very surveilled. It's just not that much by the government.
It's by private
maybe
firms.
We just don't know. But it's by private firms. I ordered an Amazon Fire Stick the other day, and 2 days later, I got an email saying, "Hey, we noticed that the Fire Stick was delivered, but you haven't installed it yet."
No, but that's a related but separate, because you raise the question of states that exercise enormous power to control their own citizenry with compliance. And I think that's a dreadful future. We actually in America may not get there because we may hand off control to private firms first. And we've, as you say, we've done so to a remarkable extent. But that's a different future. I don't think we should want either one, to be honest. But right now, there's actually a pretty big difference between them. And America, while shopping a lot of governmental surveillance globally, as I said, and you should definitely look into Palantir, this great firm out there and on the West Coast, has moved towards what Shoshana Zuboff calls that non-state form of surveillance. And again, with lots of compliance. So what your question raises is really the prospect that we may not be facing anymore the old Cold War debate between slavery and freedom, but instead between forms of slavery, both of which have compliant subjects. Of course, for abolitionists like Tolstoy and me, I don't think we should rest content with that menu and order off it and demand that freedom be placed back on it.
We started with Tolstoy, so let's come back to Tolstoy. What do you think he would say if he were around today with all of the developments, human economic developments and the developments in tech? Do you think his position would be any different today around war and policing and surveillance?
Well, so I hope he would read my book and agree and say, Sam was right that I was too early. Because the truth is that no one was trying to make war humane in his time. And actually, if you look at the laws of war that kind of grew up in his era, they weren't about humanity. They were about state brutality. making it legal, not curbing it. And I think he would see our world and say, but I was right to worry, because finally, after Vietnam, America took the dream of humane war seriously and institutionalized it. And I think he would get really upset by the result. But then I closed the book thinking a little broader, that we think of war as injury and violence, as that's bad about war, and that's why we should get concerned about it. And again, Tolstoy focused in these comparisons I mentioned between humane war and humane slavery or humane animal slaughter on injury and violence. But he was really a theorist of domination. And, that's just what we've been talking about. And so I think he would say, what I didn't realize is that war could become so humane that it could become not about injury and death, but instead about control and surveillance. And in that regard,
which also makes it endless,
correct.
I guess, as you point out.
Well, it could be endless in violent form, or it could be endless in nonviolent form. And because the Cold War, lasted a really long time. But no, you're completely right that a shift to nonviolent domination is easier to, get buy-in, especially for people who like order. And your point about the Chinese is really germane there. And for those of us who say, okay, order's a good thing, but freedom matters even more, and Tolstoy was one of them, I think we should get really upset about where we are heading, with violence increasingly edited out of domination, but it's still really sinister and something we should, try to stop if we can.
Yeah, well said. One thing I want to bring up, and I think in your book you point to the fact that a lot of the thinking around more humane war has been sort of driven by women. So, is war just like a male thing? I mean, would there be fewer wars if women were in charge?
They were really the drivers behind the peace movement, not so much the humane war movement. And I talk a lot about one of the first Nobel Peace Prize winners, the first woman who won, an Austrian baroness, who got really upset about humane war, as Tolstoy did, because she thought this is going to make peace more elusive. Now,
and this was prior to World War I.
Prior to World War I,
yeah.
Correct. Now,
right,
she was living in a place, Austria, where there were wars of German unification, and she saw what war was like on her soil, even before, the much worse First World War. But kind of, pine for these sentimental days when it was thought that giving women the vote, giving women power as politicians would pacify the world, would make for, if you'd like, a more feminine world with less masculine aggression, because we've seen that female politicians can be warmongers too. And it's hard to make the case that the enfranchise of women made for a more peaceful world. And certainly these phenomena we're talking about now, the humanization of war, doesn't seem to have been something that was especially appealing to women or something that they worried a lot about. It's rather like something that cuts across these lines between the genders or sexes. But it's really important to recall that the peace movement was seen as, and often staffed by, kind of feminists of that time.
So, what does the pragmatist in you see going forward as kind of the future of war? Given where we are we just going to see more precision killings by drones as they get smarter? One of the things that I sometimes argue is that machines and humans make different kinds of mistakes. The costs of error are different, and humans in tense situations often make terrible decisions and many mistakes, whereas machines might actually be more impervious to that kind of emotional stuff. So that part of me says, maybe machines would make for better combatants if they're programmed accordingly, and, maybe to take prisoners as opposed to not kill people. So where do you see this going? Someone told me that I asked too many questions at once, so I apologize.
No, those all seem great and are connected. I agree with you that we've entered the era of algorithmic war. I mentioned autonomous weapon systems, and those are ones that are not operated from afar by a drone. operator with a joystick, but instead follow their programming. And actually, the first such robot was used in a live war just this month in Gaza. And so we've passed the threshold. And just as we've seen drones in domestic American policing, controversially, we can foresee a time when, we'll have algorithmic policing, and it won't respect any boundary that's political in nature, because as you say, the uses of these tools are just too appealing. I think there's certainly a case that the programming can improve upon the risk of bad apples and human mistakes when you let human beings fight. On the other hand, robots don't have a reason to fight unless humans do. And so insofar as we remain in control and the Terminator doesn't arise as a result of our, tinkering, we have ethical choices about what we use the robots to do, and not just whether we program them to fight humanely, but when the programs lead them to fight in the first place. So that basic distinction I've been working with in this conversation about rules about whether to do something and rules about how the practice is conducted once it starts seem totally applicable to algorithmic war. Because our first question should be, should we have it? When should we have it? How long should it last? Not only what should it be like once it's happening.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I never thought that I would see this kind of technological capability in my lifetime. I've been in AI for most of my career, but I'm just surprised at how far and fast we've come, just way beyond anything I had imagined would be possible.
Agreed.
Well, Sam, it's been fascinating. Thank you for this conversation and for sharing your thoughts with the rest of the world.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Take care.